She walked those cold stone corridors, carrying the weight of 2 lives and the ruins of everything she thought was hers. Her name was Irene Lupine, and somewhere behind that heavy oak door, lit by nothing but candle smoke and secrets, the man she had given her whole heart to was standing before the Council of Elders, explaining calmly, deliberately, that she was nothing but a pawn. She pressed her back against the pillar, her deep blue velvet gown pooling around her feet, one trembling hand covering her mouth, the other pressed flat against the curve of her stomach. 5 months. She was 5 months along, carrying the child she had believed was the seal of something sacred between them. The child she had wept over in joy. The child she had already started naming in the quiet of her own heart. And now those same walls that had once felt like a palace were closing in around her like a cage. The muffled voices from behind the door continued, low, measured, authoritative. Tristan Cock, the Alpha King, tall and broad-shouldered, his heavy black fur-lined cloak filling the candlelit room with the kind of authority that bent lesser men at the knees, had his back to the door. He did not know she was there. He did not know that every word he spoke was landing like a blade. To his left stood High Elder Silas, older, draped in dark ornate robes, his calculating eyes gleaming in the amber candlelight. And beside him, silent as stone, were Elder Thorn and Elder Vane, men whose cold indifference had always unsettled her, but whom she had never had cause to truly fear. Until tonight. She heard Tristan's voice again, deep, controlled, unwavering. She is a pawn for the Council's favor, nothing more. The words hit her like the flat of a blade against the chest. She did not scream. She did not run. Not yet. She simply stood there, frozen between the flickering blue moonlight of the corridor and the warm glow spilling through the cracked door, and felt the architecture of her entire world collapse around her, quietly, completely, and without mercy. Then her legs remembered what her heart had not yet accepted, and she ran. Before we go any further, drop a comment right now and tell me where in the world you're watching from. I read every single one, and I love knowing how far this story is traveling. Now, let's get into it, because what happens next will absolutely wreck you. It had not always been grief. There was a time, not so long ago, when Irene Lupine had known something that felt, against every reasonable expectation, like joy. She had grown up in the outer rings of the Shadowcrest pack, in the quiet, forgettable way that Omegas learned to exist, present but peripheral, useful but unnoticed. She had no noble blood, no powerful family crest to display at pack gatherings. Her parents had died when she was young, leaving her with nothing but a modest cottage near the eastern woods, and a name that no elder would ever bother to remember. She had learned, early and well, the art of smallness. So on the night of the silver moon, the ancient ceremony in which the Alpha King selected his Luna before the full assembly of the pack, Irene had not even dressed with expectation. She had worn a simple gray shift, braided her long, dark hair back from her face, and stood in the outer ring of the gathered women exactly where she was supposed to stand, in the back, among the overlooked, beside the unbothered. The hall had been magnificent that night. Torches blazed in iron sconces along the stone walls of the great lodge. The high-ranking she-wolves of the pack stood at the front, Seraphina of the Ashbourne line, tall and luminous in silver-threaded silk, her auburn hair cascading in rehearsed perfection. Beside her, the daughters of 3 elder families, each radiating the kind of groomed, deliberate beauty that was meant to be chosen. They had spent months preparing for this moment. Irene had spent the evening reminding herself not to trip on her way out. Then the doors opened. Tristan Koch entered the hall, and the air changed. He was not merely tall, he was constructed, the way ancient things are constructed, with intention and weight. His cloak was black, fur-lined at the shoulders, and it moved with him like a second skin. His jaw was sharp, his silver blue eyes, the unmistakable Koch family mark, scanning the hall with the quiet precision of a predator who had already decided the outcome of every scenario before stepping into the room. The assembled pack fell silent the way a forest falls silent when something large moves through it. He walked the length of the hall. He passed Serafina. She did not flinch. She had been trained not to, but the slight widening of her eyes betrayed her surprise. He passed the Ashbourne daughters. He passed the elder family's heirs one by one, each of them watching him with carefully composed expressions of readiness. And then he stopped. Not at the front, not among the nobles. He stopped in the back of the hall, in the outer ring, in front of a woman in a gray shift, with her dark hair braided plainly and her hands folded in front of her as though she expected to be invisible. He stopped in front of Irene. The silence that followed was of a different quality than the one before it. This was the silence of an entire pack holding its breath and recalculating. Irene looked up at him, dark eyes meeting those impossible silver-blue ones, and felt something shift at the base of her spine. Not fear, exactly. Something older and more involuntary than fear. Tristan reached out and took her hand, turned her palm upward, and pressed his mark against her wrist in the ancient gesture of the Luna claim. His touch was steady, certain, as though he had rehearsed no other outcome. Her, he said, simply, finally, as though the answer to a question he had carried for years had just walked into the room wearing a gray shift and trying not to be noticed. The pack erupted. Elder Silas's jaw tightened behind his composed expression. Serafina's smile stayed in place, but her eyes went cold as Riverstone in winter. Irene stood in the back of the great lodge and felt, for the first time in her life, as though she had been truly seen. She did not yet understand the cost of that. The months that followed were the most disorienting of her life, and also, she would later admit, sitting alone in a different city with a different name and a child asleep in the next room, the most beautiful. Tristan's courtship was quiet and deliberate. He taught her the routes through the territory she had never been permitted to walk. He sat beside her in the library for hours without requiring conversation, as though her presence alone was sufficient company. He brought her food she hadn't asked for, and remembered without being told that she couldn't tolerate the smell of pine resin candles after dark. He was, in all the private ways that mattered, attentive in the way that only people who are paying very close attention can be, and Irene, who had spent her entire life being looked through rather than looked at, found she had no defenses against it. So she let herself trust this, quietly, carefully, and then all at once. She was 3 months along when she first suspected. 4 months when the pack healer confirmed it. A strong heartbeat, already vigorous and clear, a pup forming with the kind of early vitality that made the healer's eyes go wide before professionalism smoothed them flat again. Irene walked home from that appointment with both hands pressed against her stomach and something enormous and wordless building in her chest. She told Tristan that evening, in the garden room where she had first learned the history of the Koch bloodline. She had been rehearsing measured words all afternoon, giving him room, leaving space, not asking for more than he was prepared to give. But when she finally said it, she found she didn't need measured words at all. Tristan Koch, the Alpha King who ruled 3 territories without visible emotion and whom Elder Silas had once publicly praised for his admirable restraint, looked at her for one long, unguarded moment and then pulled her into him with both arms, his face buried in her hair, saying nothing. Which was, she discovered, the most eloquent thing he had ever done. She was certain in that moment that this was real. Then the council convened. It happened within the week. Irene heard it first through the walls of the manor, the low, heated cadence of debate carrying through the stone corridors at an hour when she was supposed to be asleep. She recognized Silas's voice, thin and precise as a blade. She heard the name Serafina repeated more than once. She heard the phrase blood law of succession with a regularity that made her stomach tighten in a way that had nothing to do with the pregnancy. She asked Tristan about it the following morning. He was at his desk studying territorial maps, and he looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read, something balanced between reassurance and carefully managed strain. "The council is restless," he said. "They want certainty around the succession. It's political. It has nothing to do with us." She believed him. She wanted to believe him. What she did not know was that Silas had already drafted a formal petition, buried in the procedural language of the purity doctrine, demanding that Tristan set her aside in favor of Seraphina of the Ashbourne line, whose bloodline the elders had been cultivating for this purpose for over a decade. She did not know that the petition contained a secondary clause, quiet and easy to miss, that authorized the removal of any non-noble mate deemed a threat to the stability of succession. Removal, the council's clean administrative word for what other people called something far darker. She did not know any of this. Not yet. The night everything ended, she had not gone looking for the truth. She had simply gone looking for him. It was late. The manor was quiet in the way it only got after midnight, when even the guards settled into the slow rhythm of the watch, and the torches in the long corridors burned down to amber. Irene had woken from a restless sleep, reached across the bed and found it empty. Tristan had been disappearing into late-night meetings more frequently over the past 2 weeks, and she had told herself it was the pressures of the territories, the logistics of the season's tribute disputes, the 100 ordinary complications of ruling that had nothing to do with her or their child. She put on her blue velvet gown, the one she wore in the evenings because it was soft against her skin, because the weight of it was a small comfort, and went looking for him. She found the council chamber by following the candlelight. The door was not fully closed. It stood open by perhaps 3 inches, enough for the warm glow from inside to spill in a thin blade across the cold stone floor of the corridor, enough for voices to carry. She stopped just outside it, one hand braced against a pillar, intending to knock, intending to simply open the door and tell him she couldn't sleep, the small, ordinary confession of a woman who trusted the man on the other side. Then she heard her name, not spoken with tenderness, not spoken with the quiet, private weight he gave it when they were alone, spoken the way one references a variable in an equation, functional, interchangeable, beside the point. She heard Silas first. "The Omega carries your heir, my king. The pack will question the legitimacy of the line if she remains unconfirmed. The Ashbourne girl is prepared. The paperwork is drawn. All that is required is your signature and your word that the Omega was never more than..." "She is a pawn for the council's favor." Tristan's voice, low, controlled, unwavering. Nothing more. The world did not end loudly. It ended in the space between 2 heartbeats, in the cold corridor outside a candlelit room, in a body of a woman in a blue velvet gown who had made the catastrophic mistake of believing she was loved. Irene did not move for a long moment. She stood very still with her hand still pressed against the stone pillar and the other flat against her stomach, and she breathed, once, twice, carefully, the way you breathe when something inside you is breaking and you cannot afford to make a sound. Then she turned, and she walked. Not running, not yet. Walking because she was 5 months pregnant and running was not something her body could sustain, and because some part of her brain had already separated itself from the grief and begun operating on pure animal practicality. She walked back through the long corridor, up the stairs, and into the room that had briefly been hers. She did not take much, a travel cloak, the small emergency purse she had kept at the back of the wardrobe out of a habit of self-preservation that she had never been able to fully unlearn. She took her documents, the identity papers from her life before the pack claimed her, paperwork that Tristan did not know she had kept. She moved with the mechanical efficiency of a woman who had always known, somewhere below the level of conscious thought, that this was how things ended for women like her. Before she left, she stood for a moment at the desk where the territorial maps were spread, held flat at the corners by iron weights. The map of the Shadowcrest territories, the contested borders Tristan had spent years securing, the land he had brought her into and called home. She took the ring from her finger, the lunar ring, dark silver, set with a single stone the color of his eyes. She placed it at the center of the map, directly over the mark of the Shadowcrest territory, with the deliberateness that was its own kind of statement. Then she walked out of the manor, into the cold pre-dawn dark, and did not look back. By the time the sun rose over the Shadowcrest Pack's eastern border, Irene Lupine was already across it, her scent suppressed with an herbal compound the pack healers kept in unlocked stores, her trail cold, her direction unknown. She did not leave a note. There was nothing left to say. She chose the city because it was the last place a werewolf with territory instincts would think to look. Not because it was safe, nothing was fully safe, but because human cities had a particular quality of anonymity that the packlands never could. In the city, no one tracked scent. No one could read the subtle physical tells that would mark her as other. In the city, a quiet woman with dark hair and a large belly was simply a quiet woman with dark hair and a large belly, and no one needed to know anything more. She settled in the western district of a mid-sized city where the rents were low and the neighbors minded their own business with the practiced determination of people who had learned that curiosity was expensive. She rented a second-floor apartment above a dry cleaning shop, paid 3 months up front in cash, and gave the landlord a name that was close enough to her own to answer to reflexively, but different enough to not show up in any pack registry. She made herself invisible by making herself ordinary. She had always been a decent writer, pack correspondence, record-keeping, the kind of quiet administrative work that Omega-ranked wolves were assigned without being asked whether they wanted it. In the human world, she found that those same skills translated. She built a small freelance practice slowly and carefully. Content work, copy editing, the invisible labor of making other people's words cleaner. Accepting only clients who communicated entirely by email and never asked for a face-to-face meeting. She kept her rates low enough to stay busy and her profile sparse enough to stay unnoticed. She was good at it. She had, after all, been practicing invisibility her entire life. Leo was born in a human hospital on a Thursday morning in February during a storm that knocked out power to half the district. The nurses worked by emergency lighting, and Irene gripped the bed rail with both hands and thought of nothing, allowed herself to think of nothing, until she heard him. His cry was not the thin, uncertain sound of most newborns. It was full-throated and immediate, a sound with presence to it, a sound that made the attending nurse pause and look up with an expression of mild, professional surprise. Irene looked at her son. Dark hair, just like hers, but those eyes, those impossible silver-blue eyes that could only have come from one place, and felt something move through her that was neither grief nor joy, but something that contained both and transcended both. "Leo," she said. Her voice was steady. She had decided the name weeks ago in the small apartment above the dry cleaning shop on a night when the storm outside was loud enough that she could cry without worrying the neighbors would hear. "Your name is Leo." He looked at her with those coach eyes, and she understood immediately that she was, in the most complete sense possible, lost to this child. Whatever she had to do to keep him safe, whatever shape her life needed to take, whatever she had to become or surrender or endure, she would do it without question. Leo grew the way that children of his nature tend to grow. Faster than expected, stronger than reasonable, and with a quality of self-possession that unsettled adults who didn't know what they were looking at. At 18 months, he was walking with the purposeful, balanced gait of a much older child. At 2 years old, his vocabulary was startling in its precision, not just large, but deliberate, as though he chose his words with the instinctive economy of someone who understood that language was a form of power. At 3, the first sign appeared. It was a Tuesday. Irene was at her desk, working through a deadline with the methodical focus she had trained herself to sustain, when she heard Leo's voice from the next room shift, not in volume, but in quality. She was on her feet before the thought fully formed. She found him in the small sitting room, standing very still in the rug, facing the window. The glass was trembling faintly in its frame. Not from wind, the day was calm. From something else. Something that was coming from inside the room, from the small, still child standing in the center of it with his fists clenched at his sides and his silver-blue eyes fixed on a point beyond the glass that only he could see. The trembling stopped when she said his name. He turned to look at her with an expression so ancient and self-aware on such a small face that her breath caught. "I heard something, far away, like when you call me but louder, from the ground." She crouched down to his level and took his face carefully in both hands. Her own face was steady. She had learned a long time ago not to let fear show on her face where he could see it. "It's okay. That's just part of what you are. We'll learn about it together." He considered this with the gravity of a small judge reviewing evidence, and then nodded as though a term had been agreed upon. "Okay," he said, and went back to his toys. That night, after he was asleep, Irene sat at the kitchen table with both hands wrapped around a mug that had gone cold and thought about what she had just witnessed. She had known, in the abstract, what his father was. She had known what that bloodline carried. But knowing a thing abstractly and watching your 3-year-old child make a window vibrate with the unfocused output of his own developing power were different orders of knowledge entirely. She pulled out the notebook she kept at the back of the kitchen drawer, the one where she recorded everything she noticed about Leo, every anomaly, every small sign, and wrote the date and a careful, specific description of what had happened. She had been keeping this record since he was born, not out of fear, out of the same practical self-preservation that had made her keep those documents in the back of the wardrobe in the manor, because knowledge was the only protection she had ever actually been able to count on. She closed the notebook, put it back in the drawer, and went to stand in the doorway of Leo's room for a long moment. He was sprawled on his back with his arms flung out wide, the way he always slept, with total physical confidence in the safety of the space around him. He looked peaceful. He looked like a child. He looked, in the dim light coming through the curtained window, so much like his father that Irene had to breathe through the old familiar ache of it before she could make herself step back. She had not allowed herself to think about Tristan in anything but the most functional terms for nearly 4 years. She thought about him only in relation to threat assessment, whether he was likely to have found her trail, whether the scent suppression was holding, whether Leo's developing abilities might somehow broadcast a signal to the pack that she couldn't detect herself. She thought about him the way you think about a weather system, with attention and without sentiment. She did not let herself think about his face in the garden room on the evening she told him about Leo. She did not let herself think about the way his arms had felt around her in that unguarded moment. She had placed those memories in a sealed room inside herself, and she did not open the door. She could not afford to open the door. She had a child with silver blue eyes and power in his bones, and no one else in the world to protect him. Sentiment was a luxury that had already cost her everything once. She would not pay that price again. 3 territories away, in the great manor of the Shadowcrest pack, the Alpha King was not sleeping either. Tristan Cox stood at the window of what had once been the library, the room where he had spent quiet evenings beside a woman in a gray shift who had somehow, without drama or declaration, become the fixed point of his entire world, and looked out at the dark grounds below. The territorial maps were still spread on the desk behind him. He had not moved the iron weights. He had not touched the ring she left at the center of the map. It sat there still, after 5 years, because removing it would have required him to accept something he refused to accept. He had not taken another mate. He would not. The council had presented him with candidates 11 times in 5 years, 11 carefully assembled women of impeccable lineage, each selected by Silas with the precision of a man who had spent decades engineering succession. And 11 times, Tristan had dismissed them with a courtesy so cold it left no room for argument. He ate, he trained, he ruled. He did all the things that a king must do to maintain the appearance of stability, while the interior of his kingdom fell into a quiet, controlled ruin. And he looked for Irene. Not loudly, not with the kind of full-pack mobilization that would have announced his desperation to every elder and every enemy. He looked for her the way a man who cannot afford to be seen searching still searches, through intermediaries, through careful payments to human authorities in cities with high omega resettlement rates, through a network of informants he had been building with painstaking patience since the morning he found the ring on the map and understood that she had heard everything. He had known the moment he found that ring exactly what she had heard, and he had stood in the empty room for a long time with the ring in his palm, facing the particular kind of devastation that only comes from understanding that you have caused enormous harm while trying to prevent a greater one. The blood law was not a metaphor. It was not council posturing. If Tristan had stood before those men and said, "She is everything. She is the only woman I would ever choose. I would burn this pack to the ground before I set her aside," which was the truth, the complete and unvarnished truth, Silas would have invoked the purity doctrine within the hour. The secondary clause would have been activated, and Irene, 5 months pregnant, carrying a child that the council considered a contamination of the bloodline, would have been quietly, procedurally, and permanently removed. So he had said the words he needed to say to keep her alive. He had stood in that room with his back straight and his voice controlled, and he had called the woman he loved a pawn, and he had meant for it to end the conversation before it could end her. He had not known she was in the corridor. He had not known that the cost of her safety would be paid in exactly this currency. He has spent 5 years living in that calculation. He had also spent 5 years making certain, in ways the council could not see, that the conditions that had forced that choice would never exist again. He was methodical about it. Elder Vane had retired under circumstances Tristan had engineered with quiet precision over the course of 18 months. Elder Thorne had found himself facing a land dispute that occupied his political attention almost entirely, courtesy paperwork filed by intermediaries Tristan had positioned 2 years in advance. The council's power was not gone, not yet, but it was eroding, slowly and deliberately, like stone underwater. Tristan was patient. He had learned patience the way you learn it when the alternative is destroying the only thing that might bring the person you love home safe. Because there was something else, something that had taken his investigators 18 months to uncover, and that Silas did not know he knew. The records in the old archive, the ones that documented the circumstances of deaths and disappearances within the pack going back 3 generations, contained a cluster of entries from 22 years ago that, when read in sequence, told a very specific story. A low-ranking couple in the Eastern Territory, a land dispute manufactured from nothing, an accident during a boundary survey that claimed both their lives and left their young daughter to be raised as a ward of the pack, a ward with no family, no allies, no one to fight for her. No one who might stand up if the Alpha King chose her and the council decided she needed to be removed. Silas had not chosen Irene by accident. He had built her. He had spent 20 years carefully constructing the conditions that would produce a woman isolated enough to be discarded, and then he had waited for her to cross Tristan's path, trusting that nature and proximity would do the rest. He expected, when the time came, to pull her from the board without resistance. He had not accounted for the fact that Irene Lupien would pull herself from the board first, and he had not accounted for the child she carried to be anything but a political inconvenience. Tristan turned from the window, picked up the file on his desk, the latest report from the human city in the Western District, the one his contact in the local police department had flagged 3 weeks ago, and read it again, though he had already memorized it. A woman matching a certain description. A child, approximately 5 years old, with unusual physical development for his age. Silver blue eyes. Documented by a school registration form that the contact had photographed and forwarded. Silver blue eyes. The Koch family trait, carried through the blood with the fidelity of a brand. He set the file down. For 5 years, he had been paying the human authorities in that city to keep every pack-affiliated entity away from her, to flag anything unusual, to run interference, to ensure that she existed in a bubble of protection that she could not see and that he could not yet explain. He had been waiting, not because he was passive, because he was not yet strong enough to bring her home to a pack that was still partly under Silas's authority, and he had known, with the cold certainty of a man who had already made one catastrophic miscalculation, that if he went to her too soon, he would only be delivering her back into danger. But the school registration form changed things. Leo was 5. He was old enough to be remembered. His eyes were too distinctive. The longer Irene stayed in that city, the more visible her son would become, and visible was the one thing they could not afford. Silas had trackers, and Silas, whatever else he was not stupid. Tristan reached for his cloak, the heavy black fur-lined one, the one that had hung on the same hook for 5 years, and made a decision he had been preparing for, with precise and grinding patience, since the morning he found a ring at the center of a map and understood the full weight of what his words had cost. It was time to go get his family. He found her on a Wednesday. It was the kind of unremarkable autumn afternoon that cities produced in abundance. Gray sky, leaves turning along the pavement, the smell of coffee from a cart near the park entrance. Tristan had been in the city for 4 days, moving carefully, staying in a nondescript hotel 2 districts away from the address his contact had flagged, watching the rhythms of the neighborhood before he made any move. He had not survived 5 years of council politics by being impatient. He saw her from across the playground. She was sitting on a bench at the far edge of the fenced area, a paper coffee cup in both hands, watching the children with the particular quality of attention that parents develop, present but not hovering, tracking without interfering. She was wearing a dark coat he didn't recognize, her long hair loose around her shoulders, and he registered this with a precision that bypassed every rational filter he possessed, exactly like herself. 5 years had not changed the fundamental architecture of her, the way she held her shoulders, the slight forward tilt of her head when she was thinking, the stillness she carried that was not passivity, but something much more deliberate. He stood at the park entrance for a moment and simply breathed. Then a child on the climbing frame let out a shout of pure exhilaration, the kind of sound that contains nothing but the uncomplicated joy of height and speed. And Irene looked up and laughed, a real laugh, unguarded, her whole face changing with it. And Tristan followed her gaze. The boy was at the top of the climbing frame, arms spread wide, utterly unconcerned with the distance to the ground. He was small for 5, but he moved with a physical confidence that outpaced his size by years, balanced, deliberate, easy in his body in the way that only certain children are. Dark hair, Irene's dark hair, Irene's jawline, Irene's quickness in the way he turned his head. And then he turned fully toward the park entrance, scanning the space with an instinct that was not a 5-year-old's instinct, and Tristan saw his eyes. Silver blue, the exact shade of the Koch bloodline, carried through 3 generations without variation, as distinctive and unambiguous as a signature. The impact of it was not subtle. It moved through Tristan like a current. Not surprise exactly, because he had already known, the school registration form had already told him, but seeing and knowing are different things entirely, and seeing his own eyes in the face of a small boy on a climbing frame in a human city playground on a gray Wednesday afternoon was a different order of experience that anything a file or a photograph could have prepared him for. Irene didn't just leave, the thought arrived with a quiet, devastating clarity. She took everything. He understood, standing there at the park entrance with his hands still in his coat pockets, that the calculation he had been running for 5 years, the one in which he was the wronged party, the one in which his deception had been an act of protection that she simply hadn't understood, was incomplete. She had left carrying his child. She had built a life from nothing, in a city that wasn't hers, with no pack, no protection, no one at her back. She raised her son alone, and from the look of the boy currently descending the climbing frame with the unhurried confidence of someone who has never been given cause to doubt his own competence, she had done it extraordinarily well. He had protected her from the council. He had not protected her from himself. Leo hit the ground and ran toward the bench, and Irene stood and caught him, steadied him, brushed something from his jacket with the automatic efficiency of a mother who has performed this gesture 10,000 times. And then, because the wind shifted, or because the instinct in his blood was already more developed than any 5-year-old's had a right to be, Leo went still. He turned and looked directly at Tristan across the full width of the playground. Children did not usually look at strangers with that quality of attention. It was not a child's gaze. It was a measured, assessing gaze, and it sat in a child's face with an unnerving naturalness that confirmed everything the school registration form had only implied. Irene followed her son's gaze. The moment she saw him, every line of her body changed. The coffee cup lowered, her chin came up, her shoulders pulled back into the posture she had adopted when she was frightened and had decided that no one was going to know it. Her hand moved to Leo's shoulder, not pulling him behind her, but placing itself there with a steadiness that was unmistakably territorial. She did not run. He half expected her to run. Instead, she stood her ground on that bench-side square of pavement, in her dark coat, with her dark hair loose and her hand on Leo's shoulder, and she looked at him across the playground with an expression that was not grief, was not rage, was something harder and more controlled than either of those things. She looked at him like a woman who had already survived the worst he could be capable of, and was simply waiting to find out what he wanted now. He made her follow him home. She did not invite him. She simply turned, said something brief and quiet to Leo, took the boy's hand, and walked out of the park. The implicit message was clear enough. Not here, not in public, not in front of him. Tristan followed at a distance and did not push. The apartment was on the second floor, small, clean, organized with the particular purposefulness of a space where every object had earned its place. Books on every flat surface, a child's drawings tacked to the wall above a low table, the drawings of a child who was already at 5, producing images with an unusual spatial clarity. A laptop on the kitchen table with 3 separate documents open. A notebook tucked at the back of a kitchen drawer, he noticed, with the corner worn for frequent handling. Irene had settled Leo with a snack and a picture book in his room with the door partly closed before she came back to the kitchen. She stood on the far side of the table, and she did not offer him a seat. He did not take one anyway. They looked at each other across the small kitchen in the amber light of an autumn afternoon, and 5 years of silence sat between them like a third presence in the room. "You found us," she said. Her voice was level, not warm, not hostile. Level in the way that things are level when enormous effort has been applied to make them so. "3 weeks ago," he said, "I've been watching the neighborhood, making sure it was safe to come to you directly." Something moved in her expression, a flicker of something complicated that she controlled quickly. "3 weeks," she said. "I needed to be certain the city was clean, that no one else had found you first." "No one else?" She repeated the words with a careful neutrality that he recognized as a question. He told her about the trackers he had placed with the local human authorities. He told her about the payments, the years of quiet interference, the bubble of protection he had maintained around her from a distance. He watched her face as he said it, watched the controlled neutrality develop hairline fractures as she processed what it meant, that she had never been as invisible as she believed, that the anonymity she had built with such meticulous effort had been reinforced without her knowledge or consent by the man she had fled. "You've been watching me for 5 years, she said. "Protecting you," he said. "There's a difference." "Is there?" It was not a question. He pulled out a chair then and sat down, because this was going to take a while and he was not going to have it standing up like an interrogation. He placed both hands flat on the table and looked at her directly. "I need you to let me explain the blood law, what it actually says, what would have happened if I had spoken in that room the way I wanted to speak." She was quiet for a moment. Then she sat, slowly, in the chair across from him, not because she was softening, but because she was, as she had always been, someone who gathered information before she made decisions. He told her everything. He told her about the purity doctrine and the secondary clause. He told her what removal meant in the legal language of the council, not exile, not displacement, but the permanent and procedurally sanctioned elimination of any non-noble mate deemed a threat to succession stability. He told her that the words she had heard him say were the price of her life, that he had known the door was not fully closed, but he had not known she was there, that the calculation he had made in that room, cold, pragmatic, terrible, had been the right calculation for her survival and the wrong calculation for everything else. He watched her face through all of it. She did not interrupt. She did not cry. She sat with her hands folded on the table and she listened, and he could see her mind working, evaluating, cross-referencing, testing what he was telling her against the architecture of everything she had already lived through. When he finished, the kitchen was very quiet. "You could have told me. Afterward. You could have found a way." "I know," he said. And he meant it without qualification or defense, because there was no defense to offer. He had made a choice in a crisis and he had made it without her, and she had paid for it in 5 years of exile, and a child raised without a father, and a life built from scratch in a city that wasn't hers. The fact that the alternative had been her death did not erase the cost of the method. He understood that. He had understood it for a long time. "I know," he said again, "and I am sorry. Not for keeping you alive, for the way it was done, for all of it." Another long silence. In Leo's room, they could hear the small sounds of a child absorbed in a picture book, pages turning, the occasional quiet sound that children make when something in a story satisfies them. Irene looked at the wall and then back at him, and her expression had shifted into something he couldn't fully read, something that was neither forgiveness nor its absence, but something that existed in the complicated space between the two. "He has your eyes," she said. "I know," Tristan said, and his voice came out quieter than he intended. He's extraordinary. She said it simply, without performance, a statement of observed fact. Whatever he is, whatever he's becoming, it's already more than either of us fully understands. I know that too. She looked at him for a long moment. Why now? She asked. Why come now after 5 years? He reached into his coat and placed the intelligence file on the table between them. It was thin, 3 pages, but the information it contained was specific enough to be unmistakable. Tracker activity, scent reports from 2 cities over. Silas had not been idle. Silas had never been idle. Because he found you first, or he will within weeks, and when he does, he won't come alone. Irene looked at the file for a long moment without touching it. Then she looked up. How long do we have? They had less than she hoped and more than she feared. The first tracker arrived at the dry cleaning shop below the apartment 2 days later. Tristan had been staying in the building, on the narrow couch in the sitting room, without discussion, because the situation made the question of where he slept irrelevant in comparison to the question of whether they survived the week. He caught the scent from the second-floor window at 3 in the morning. He was on his feet and at the door before the thought had fully formed. He woke Irene with a hand on her shoulder and 2 words. They're here. She was dressed in 40 seconds. He had timed her once, years ago, during a pack emergency drill that she had participated in with the quiet efficiency of someone who always understood that safety was provisional. Some things did not change. Leo was harder. He was 5, and 5-year-olds did not respond well to being woken at 3 in the morning and told to be very quiet. But Leo looked at his mother's face, at the controlled, specific alertness she was wearing, and something in him recognized it for what it was. He went quiet without being asked. He put his shoes on. He reached up and took Tristan's hand with the matter-of-fact trust of a child who had not yet learned to question the instinct that told him this person is safe. And Tristan, who had commanded armies and broken council deadlocks and navigated the most treacherous political terrain his world had to offer, had to take a breath before he could move. There were 3 trackers. Silas had sent 3, which meant he was confident but not certain. If he had been certain, he would have sent 6. They came through the back entrance of the building and the fire doors simultaneously, which was competent enough, but they had not accounted for the fact that the Alpha King was already between them and the stairwell. What followed was brief and not gentle. Tristan handled the first 2 in the narrow corridor below the landing, while Irene took Leo to the 3rd-floor fire exit. And he had almost forgotten, in the years of political maneuvering and careful strategy, what it felt like to watch her move in a genuine emergency. She had no combat training, not formally, but she had 5 years of single-mother survival instincts and the focused ferocity of a woman with her child in her arms. And she was fast. She was very fast. The 3rd tracker came around the corner of the landing and found her already there, Leo behind her, her arm barring the way, and the look on her face stopped him for precisely the half-second that Tristan needed to come up the stairs and end the problem. Afterward, in the cold stairwell with Leo pressed against the wall between them, and all 3 trackers neutralized and bound, Tristan looked at Irene across the dim space, and she looked back at him, and the 5 years of distance between them compressed for a moment into something more immediate. "We need to leave the city tonight," he said. "I know," she said. "I need you to come back to the pack." She held his gaze for a long moment. "I know that too," she said. "But we're going to talk about what that means before we go anywhere." They talked in the car. Driving through the pre-dawn dark on the highway east, Leo asleep across the back seat with his dark head resting on the rolled-up coat that Irene had folded into a pillow, with the automatic competence that still, after everything, made something in Tristan's chest tighten. She did not negotiate from a place of anger. That was the first thing he noticed, and it told him more about who she had become in 5 years than anything else could have. She negotiated from a place of absolute clarity, the clarity of a woman who had built a life from nothing and knew precisely what she had proven about herself and what she required in exchange for what she was prepared to give. The councils, she said, would be dissolved before she set foot in the Shadow Crest pack as Luna. Not weakened, not reformed, dissolved. She understood that this was a political undertaking that could not happen overnight, but she required his formal commitment, in writing, witnessed by the pack historian, before she would take her place beside him publicly. Leo would be raised with full knowledge of his human side, the city, the life, the years of ordinary human existence that had shaped him as much as his blood had. He would not be presented to the pack as a coke heir who had been raised in hiding. He would be presented as a child who had lived in two worlds and been made stronger by both. This was not negotiable. And she would take her seat at the head of the pack not as a recovered Luna who had been brought back by her king. She would take it as a woman who had returned on her own terms, by her own choice, because she decided it was time. The distinction mattered. It mattered for her, and it mattered for every Omega in the Shadowcrest pack who had ever been told that their value was conditional on someone else's assessment of their lineage. Tristan listened to all of it without interruption. In the back seat, Leo slept with the total physical abandon of a child who had decided, somewhere in the transition from stairwell to car to highway, that the situation had been handled and he could safely let go of it. Yes, Tristan said, to all of it, without qualification. Irene turned to look at him in the dark of the car. That was fast, she said. I've had 5 years to think about what I would agree to if you ever let me make this right. I had a list. Something shifted in her expression. Not quite a smile, but adjacent to one in the way that things are adjacent to the thing they're becoming before they fully arrive. I want to see the evidence about my parents, she said. The shift was gone. Her voice was level again. Everything Fenris found. I want to see it myself before any of it is presented to the pack. It will be the first thing I show you when we arrive, he said. She turned back to the road ahead and was quiet for a while. Outside the windows, the highway was emptying as they moved further from the city, the lights thinning, the dark on either side deepening into the particular quality of dark that only exists in territory, in land that is claimed and known and old. She asked me about you, she said. 3 months ago. He asked why he didn't have a father. Tristan was quiet. I told him that his father was a king who was trying to make his kingdom safe enough to come home to. She said it without looking at him. I don't know why I said it that way. It was the truest thing I could think of that wouldn't... She stopped. Thank you, he said. She didn't answer, but she didn't look away from the road with the specific rigidity of someone suppressing an emotion. She looked at the road ahead with something that was, for the first time in 5 years, not entirely closed. The Shadowcrest pack received them at dawn. Tristan had sent word ahead, not to the council, but to the pack members directly, through channels that bypassed Silas entirely. The people who lined the approach to the Great Lodge were not there because they had been assembled. They were there because word had traveled the way words travel in packs, through the living connective tissue of shared blood and territory, and they had come of their own accord to see what everyone had quietly hoped for and publicly not dared to say. Irene walked through them with Leo's hand in hers and her chin level, and Tristan walked beside her, not in front, not behind, and the message of that positioning was not lost on anyone who saw it. High Elder Silas was waiting in the sacred grove. He had not come to welcome them. His expression when they entered the ancient circular clearing with its standing stones and its overhead canopy of old-growth oak was the expression of a man who had anticipated this moment and prepared for it. He stood in his dark ornate robes, with Elder Thorn on his left and 2 ceremonial guards flanking him, and he invoked the purity rite with the fluid precision of someone who had been rehearsing it for days. The words were old and formal and carried the full weight of blood law authority. He was invoking the right of the council to assess the heir's legitimacy, to rule on the mother's standing, to exercise the procedural powers that had governed pack succession for 3 generations. His voice was steady. He believed, Irene realized, that procedure would protect him. He believed that as long as he stayed within the letter of the law would hold. He had not accounted for Fenris. The pack historian emerged from the tree line at the edge of the grove with a leather-bound archive under one arm and the unhurried gait of a man who had spent years waiting to be useful. He was lean, scholarly, with a scar across one eye and the careful precision of someone who had built his entire life around the weight of documented fact. He placed the archive on the flat surface of the central standing stone and opened it to a marked page without drama. The documents were old, Some were 3 decades old, but they were clear and they were specific, and they named names, including the name of the High Elder who had authorized a land dispute in the Eastern Territory 22 years ago that had resulted in the deaths of one low-ranking couple and the orphaning of their young daughter. Fenris read the relevant entries in a measured voice while the assembled pack listened, and the morning light came through the canopy of the sacred grove in long, slow columns. Silas began to speak over him, to invoke authority, to question provenance, to deploy the procedural language that had always been his most reliable weapon. His voice rose. His composure cracked at the edges, not fully, he was too controlled for that, but enough for the pack to see it. And then Leo let go of his mother's hand. He stepped forward into the center of the grove with the same unhurried, balanced confidence with which he had descended the climbing frame in the city playground, and he stood on the ancient earth of the sacred grove, and he was very still for a moment. Irene did not reach for him. She watched him with her hands at her sides and her face open, because she had learned by now that there were things her son was capable of that were beyond her capacity to direct or contain, and the only thing she could offer him in those moments was her absolute, unflinching presence. The sound began deep, below the range of normal hearing, felt in the chest before it was processed by the ear, a resonance that came up through the ground and through the stones and through the roots of the old-growth oaks, as though the grove itself were vibrating at a frequency it recognized. Leo's eyes, those impossible silver-blue cock eyes, were fixed on a point that no one else could see, and his small chest expanded, and he opened his mouth, and the primal howl came out of him. It was not a child's sound. It was not precisely a wolf's sound either, though it contained that. It was older than both of those things, a sound that belonged to the category of things that are true before they are named, before there is language for them, before there is law to govern them. It moved through the sacred grove like weather. It moved through every person standing in that clearing like a current of recognition, something in the blood responding before the mind could engage, the ancient and inarguable signal of an alpha whose authority was not political, was not inherited, was not conferred by any elder or any law or any ceremony, but was simply fundamentally real. The standing stones hummed, the canopy shivered without wind, and one by one, beginning with the pack members at the edges of the grove and moving inward towards the center, every wolf in that clearing lowered their head. Every wolf, including the 2 ceremonial guards flanking Silas, including Elder Thorn, whose head dropped with the involuntary certainty of a body that had received an unambiguous instruction from something more authoritative than conscious will, including every member of the assembled pack who had come to witness what they quietly hoped for and publicly had not dared to say. Silas did not lower his head. He was too old for instinct to fully override calculation, and he was too invested in the scaffolding of his authority to dismantle it without a fight. But he was also, for the first time in 30 years of political maneuvering, looking at a situation he had not engineered and could not control. His composure did not crack so much as it became suddenly beside the point. Tristan stepped forward and stripped the ceremonial authority from the council in 3 sentences that were not heated or dramatic, but were final, in the way that things are final when the ground has shifted beneath them and everyone present can feel it. The blood law stood. He did not invoke emergency powers. He invoked the ancient precedent of the primal confirmation, which predated the council's authority by 2 centuries and required no elder approval. The primal howl of a recognized heir was, under the oldest law the pack possessed, sufficient and self-contained. What the grove recognized, the pack recognized. What the pack recognized, the council had no standing to question. Fenris closed the archive. Elder Thorn sat down heavily on one of the stone benches at the edge of the grove, and High Elder Silas stood in the center of the ancient clearing in his ornate dark robes and understood, with the particular quality of understanding that arrives too late to be useful, that he had built a trap and placed it precisely where he himself would one day need to stand. He was escorted from the grove by pack members he had appointed. The indignity of that was not lost on anyone. Later, Much later, after the formal proceedings and the pack assembly and the hours of documentation that followed any transfer of authority, Irene stood at the window of the chamber that looked out over the Eastern Territory. Leo was asleep 2 rooms away, exhausted and entirely peaceful in the manner of a child who had expended something enormous and then let it go completely. The grounds below were quiet. The grove was quiet. The whole territory had a quality of stillness that felt, for the first time in as long as she could remember, like something other than held breath. Tristan came to stand beside her, not behind her, not at a managed distance, beside her, close enough that she was aware of him in the uncomplicated physical way that had never fully left, that had survived 5 years of exile and grief and careful reconstruction. He did not speak immediately, neither did she. Below them, the Shadow Crest territory stretched into the dark, the forests, the contested borders that had been secured at enormous cost, the eastern woods where she had grown up invisible and peripheral and careful, the land that had taken everything from her family and then offered her, years later, the choice of whether to take it back. She had taken it back, on her terms, at her pace, in the company of a child with silver blue eyes and power in his bones, who had stood in an ancient grove and spoken in a language older than law. The council will be formally dissolved by the end of the month. Fenris has the documentation ready. It's clean. I know. I read the draft this afternoon. A pause. You read it fast. I read everything fast, she said. You knew that about me. I knew a great deal about you, he said. I suspect I have a great deal left to learn. She looked out at the territory for another moment. Then she turned and looked at him in the dim light of the chamber, the broad shoulders, the sharp jaw, those silver blue eyes that she had first seen across the floor of the Great Lodge, and then spent 5 years working very hard not to think about. He looked, she thought, like a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had not yet fully registered that he was allowed to set it down. We're not the same people we were, she said. No, we're not. I need you to understand that I'm not coming back to what we were. I'm not stepping into the shape of what existed before. She held his gaze. If we build something here, it will be something new, equal and transparent, or it will be nothing. Equal and transparent, and nothing less. He paused. I had 5 years to decide what I wanted if I ever had the chance to ask for it. I don't want to be a king who rules through secrets. I want to be a partner who rules beside you. The word beside landed with a quiet weight that she felt rather than heard. She looked at him for a long moment, in the way that she had always looked at things she was deciding whether to trust, carefully, completely, without the pretense of indifference. Then she turned back to the window, and after a moment, she let her shoulder rest against his, and he was still beside her, and outside the first gray light of early morning was beginning to come up over the eastern territory of the Shadow Crest Pack. It was not reconciliation in the simple sense of the word. It was something more difficult and more durable than that. 2 people choosing, with full knowledge of the cost and the terrain, to build something on ground that had already broken once and been rebuilt into separate hands, into separate shapes, and to trust that what they made together this time would hold. Below them, the territory was quiet. In 2 rooms over, their son slept with his arms flung wide, dreaming whatever dreams a 5-year-old true alpha dreams in the first night of his rightful home. The story was not over. There would be politics, and there would be grief, and there would be the long, unglamorous work of dismantling a century of corrupt law and replacing it with something just. There would be days when the distance between who they had been and who they were trying to become felt uncrossable, and days when it did not. But the grove had spoken, the pack had heard, and Irene Lupian, who once stood in the back of a great hall in a gray shift and been told by the posture of the world that she was not worth noticing, stood now at the window of her territory in the first light of a new morning, with her shoulder warm against her king's, and felt the shape of a future that was entirely, irrevocably hers.